So we're going to talk about something nice and light this morning. We're going to talk about democracy and its constant need for struggle. So I've been studying history and classics for 4 years now. And during this process, I've come to a conclusion that you don't need a history or classics degree to understand, and that is American society today and ancient Greek society are very different. However, they are both connected by this common strand, democracy. So I set out to wonder, are there any universal principles in democracy that tie our societies together? And the conclusion I came to is this very simple thesis: democracy demands strife. And by strife, I mean a constant state of political struggle, agonistic, competitive in the political realm. And an easy way to understand this is through Charles Darwin. So, in Darwin's theory, everything, the natural world is based upon a natural state of struggle. And everyone evolves and adapts based on this grounded principle that you are always competing. And democracy in the political realm is very comparable. A citizen in a democracy is struggling for political significance against other citizens. And the easiest way you can see this is in a vote. A vote for something is an agonistic expression against something else. And just like how in Darwin's theory, without struggle, the system breaks down, if you do not have, say, the vote in a democracy, the democracy breaks down. And because a democracy doesn't dominate all of global society the way Darwin's world does, you have two kinds of strife in a democratic society. You have internal strife, which is competition against the citizenry, which you can see in votes. You can see in debates over national identity, like abortion or gun control. And you can see it in the most extreme case in civil war. And then you have external strife, which is when a democracy suspends itself mostly in a state of kind of political unity of one political direction and competes with something outside of its borders. So the most obvious example of this is war, which we'll be talking about more in a minute. But that's not the only expression of external strife. You can have humanitarian aid, movements for climate change, things like this. And then also nonviolent state rivalries like the Olympic Games or the space race. But for my project, I have chosen war to focus on because I'm a war historian. I know a lot about war. And a project that shows struggle across all braids of democracy would be incredibly long. So war is common. It is one of the most impactful things a state can do, so I've deemed it important for study. And I don't need to explain how war is a state of struggle, like I would a vote or the Olympic Games or something like that. And the other reason I chose war is because war in 21st century America and war in 5th century Athens are two very different things. So by showing that the quota for strife is maintained across these two very different approaches to war, I hope that encourages my argument. So 5th century Athens was a democracy, unlike a lot of its other Greek counterparts. But the classical Greek world, war was completely integrated into society, citizens, and citizens. War was a natural part of the democratic cycle in 5th century Athens. Citizens voted for war when they wanted war, and then they went to war. There's no middleman, there's no external causes for war. People, when they wanted it, they did it. If war was brought to them, they would respond. And you can see this reflected in their poetry. Memorizing the 2,500 lines of the Iliad was commonplace in this society. They knew war, they loved war. It was a celebrated thing. You can see it in their drama. You can see it in my thesis focuses on the works of Tyrtaeus, which you probably haven't heard of, but I recommend looking it up. It's an amazing piece on how war affects all aspects of Greek society. It was fully integrated. So when the Athenian people went to war, it was a natural phenomenon in the democratic cycle of struggle. They would engage with this outside force, they would fight, they would win or lose, and then they would come back, and democracy would keep on evolving based on the shifting will of the citizens and what they wanted. So the main point I used for this was the Sicilian expedition in ancient Athens, which helped my argument a lot because it shows the people striving for strife in a way that's more than political. We have excerpts from Thucydides about the speech, or the assembly meeting where they debated the question for war. And there's every logical political reason to go against it, but every speech for it shows how it's appealing to this Athenian nature for struggle. And if you're not going to war, you're going against your nature, and you're defying the democratic process, essentially. So war has become very different in the 21st century. And Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address, had it right. He pegged it right on the money. This idea that nuclear weapons especially, but other advances in military technology, has made war swift, completely destructive, and completely unpredictable, to the point that citizens can no longer respond to it in the way that you could in an Athenian context, or even in the American context of World War I and World War II, where you see mobilizations for war, and then when the war's over, you come back down. But in a state of nuclear deterrence or terror strikes, you can't have this. You need a force that exists outside of the will of the people in this kind of vigilant posture, always ready for war. So war, essentially, where it was once one part in the democratic evolutionary cycle, it now becomes a break in the evolutionary cycle. So the people have been, but war is still a political action that a democracy must take. So when the people's source of external strife is severed, they have to find it elsewhere. So you can see this now in rampant internal strife whenever the United States goes to war. And the first place, and most glaring place you can see this, is Vietnam. You can look at the whole decade of the 60s and most of the 70s as just this very anti-military, anti-government movement where the people cannot express themselves in an external struggle, so they are doing it internally. And you can see this with the music. A song like Fortunate Son is literally coming out and saying, I ain't no military son. I am not, the democracy is no longer part of the military, so the people need to achieve their strife through other means in this political function of war. And you can also see this in the opposite way with the military. I analyzed a lot of press conferences from General Westmoreland, who was the commander of US forces in Vietnam, and his approach is the exact same way how the military-industrial complex exists entirely removed from the will of the people. And it's this very competitive kind of persona that he puts up. He's very dismissive of what the people want. He says that they don't understand the military realities of the world, which could absolutely be true, but it still represents a break in the democratic cycle. So why is this important? I think by showing that democracy demands strife is important because in Athens, democracy and the question of having a democratic government was a continual political dialogue. They were always thinking about democracy, they were always criticizing, commenting on democracy. And that's something we really don't have in 21st century America. We take democracy for granted to a certain extent, I believe. And then strife as it exists in 21st century America is in a very precarious place. You have the Donald Trumps of this country, which are looking to really strife in the excess, looking for these very agonistic approaches to, we are against Latin Americans, we are against Muslims, and this has destroyed democracies before. It destroyed Athens when it voted to go to Sicily, and this is dangerous. But on the opposite side, you have extreme left-wing views with this kind of over-obsession with political correctness and kind of an emphasis on socialized policies, which, while a response to our world, and a perfectly natural response to our world, is estranging society from strife. So I think it's important to remember, if you are dedicated to liberty and democracy, the engine by which democracy runs, which I believe is struggle. Thank you.
As the military technology continues to develop, and getting more and more automated, separating U.S. citizenry more and more from the actual realities of war, what do you think the implications of that for society for national discourse will be? Will it become more pro-war? Will people try to find strife internally? Where do you expect the conflict to come from?
So a further advancement in military technologies will only make military power more sudden and more completely destructive. So it'll exist completely outside of the democratic process. So if today is any inclination, we are moving more and more against war, which I think will be an interesting problem because as the past 2,400 years of human history has shown, war doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So I think it's just going to we'll see more elevated situations. If we have any kind of conflict on the scale that we had in Vietnam today, the level of internal strife is going to be incredible.
Can you speak more about how in Athens they would vote to go to war? I think that's pretty interesting, and like whether or not, like, let's say I voted against to go to war, did I still have to go? Like, how did that process work?
So Athens was a direct democracy, whereas here we have a representative democracy. So the people would all gather in a hill at the city called the Nix, and they would vote whether or not the question for war would be proposed, and people would speak for or against it. And at the end, everyone had one vote, and simple process of majority. And if you voted against it, you would go.
Still have to go.
Yeah, you still had to go. Frank?
So that, I'm assuming it was compulsory military service in Athens. Do you think today, with the more like sudden and destructive forms of warfare, would a draft, for example, and compulsory military service do anything to sort of preserve strife in the way that you suggest?
I would have to say no, because my thoughts on it is that 21st century warfare exists entirely outside of people's reactions. So it doesn't really matter if you're forced to join the military or not. You can see it with the draft in Vietnam. People were forced to join the military, but that didn't really resolve any of this. None of the strife really transferred to this external nature. It was all still very internal. And I mean, you can even see it in the way that soldiers handled themselves in Vietnam, that they weren't really concerned with who they were fighting as much as they were concerned with the establishment with which they were a part of. Elena?
So what role do you think media had on causing internal strife in Vietnam, such as, being able to televise events?
So I mean,
Pictures from war?
21st century, yeah, the media, you can say, plays a huge role, and it shows the people the war that's going on for their country, and they disagree with it, they oppose it. But it's pretty comparable to the Athenian situation, where the people, the citizens who voted on war and who were engaged with thoughts of war also went to war. So they all saw it. So I'd say it's about an even keel. It's just in a different way.